Hello you, welcome to Writing at Masters Level 7. So we're going to be looking at how to write an essay or assignment, whatever you want to call it, at Masters Level 7. And we're going to take in sort of four sort of categories, I suppose, of things you need to think about and to try to start doing. The first one is, I tried to make the first one as close to a sort of ABC type thing as I could get, and the closest I could get was argument, background reading, context. I'll explain that more in a couple of slides' time, so that's sort of the first thing we're going to get into. Hopefully it will make sense, but I thought if I can get it to an ABC type mnemonic, it might help you to remember it. So we're going to quickly have a look at the essay title, and then we will look at a couple of example passages and start breaking those down and having a look at actually, what is Masters Writing and how, therefore, can you do it? So this is the title, an investigation into inclusion, special educational needs and disability, a reflective case study of a school SEND policy and provision. That's reasonably straightforward. We had 3 assignments during my course. This was the last one. It was the longest one. It clocked in, I think, 4,000 words, I think. Obviously, I've had the essay open on my screen. I could just look, but I don't, so I can't. And it would take me a minute to open it up and pause the video, but I'm not doing that either. It's about 4,000 in that area. It's reasonably straightforward. The idea of the final essay was that it was an investigation into something relating to our teaching practice. So the first one was a kind of a generic-y, what is school type essay, and then the second one was picking out something a bit more specific. Again, I can't remember what. It would take me a moment to look. And then the final one was this one. An investigation to inclusion, SEND, a reflective case study of a school SEND policy and a provision. So basically what I did was I had a look through the policies at the school, picked out a couple that I thought were quite interesting. In the end, I think I went for one relating to behaviour, and I selected a student that was actually a student that I was teaching in one of my classes. He was a Year 7 boy who had some behavioural issues. I don't think from memory he had any kind of a diagnosis of any formal nature. He had constant support. He had a TA in the room with him pretty much every lesson. I can't recall actually an occasion when he didn't have somebody with him. But he had quite challenging behaviour. He didn't like IT, which was a problem for me because that was what I was teaching him. He didn't like that. Didn't care for that at all. And so I had to think a lot around when I was planning my lessons, how can I try and engage him? How can I get him on board? And that was tricky. That's a lot really to deal with when you're training. Yeah. So that's what I did. So I picked a particular student, I picked a particular policy, and I focused everything around them. So I'm going to quickly read through this paragraph. By all means, fast forward through it. You haven't got to listen to my stupid voice for any longer than necessary. I'm going to quickly read through it, and then we're going to be looking at argument, background reading, context, ABC. Or ABRC. So I reckon give me a minute if you want to fast forward it. That should be long enough. Go. Staub and Peck, 1994, evaluated the existing literature on the effects of inclusion on children without SEND, and they found that it had no impact on their academic achievement. These findings were echoed by Pujol, Nacken and Mand, 2003, cited in Rugis, Van der Veen and Pietzma, 2010, when they evaluated the research from the intervening period, and again by Rugis, Van der Veen and Pietzma, 2010. One ought to take stock of the fact that these studies fail to differentiate between the likely varied ability levels of the groups of developmentally typical students. But even with this in mind, it seems reasonable to assert that inclusive education has not been proven to have any detrimental impact on the educational outcomes of children without additional needs. Indeed, in catering to the needs of children with SEND, teachers may concurrently adapt their teaching and classroom management in ways which benefit the less able, developmentally typical students. I think that was about a minute. So basically this whole paragraph is about inclusion, and the point that I'm making in this paragraph is that inclusion has obviously got benefits to the children who are being included. That's why inclusion exists, if it's done correctly, and hasn't been shown to have any detrimental impact on the students who don't have any additional needs. When I did my degree, I remember writing an essay about inclusion, and I remember reading a lot about parents having an issue with the fact that if you have children in a mainstream school who have additional needs, that is drawing attention away from their children, and that therefore they're suffering academically. And studies have shown that, while that probably is the case in some places, everything that could happen does happen somewhere in the world. It's just not empirically provable. Now, the essay isn't about SEND, about inclusion. If we look back at it, Investigation into Inclusion, Special Educational Needs and Disability, a reflective case study of a school SEND policy and provision. Obviously, if I'm talking about SEND in a mainstream setting, which isn't made clear from the essay title, but is made clear from the start of the essay, clearly I'm talking about inclusion, because clearly we're talking about a student who has additional needs in a mainstream school. He's therefore being included. So although this paragraph on inclusion isn't directly relevant to the essay title, the context in which I will have used this paragraph, it's quite early on in the essay. I'm kind of setting the ground for the school's inclusion policy, so it is relevant. So don't worry about it, it's fine. Because relevance is important. Don't just talk about any old rubbish just because it's about schools in the hopes that, I'm 500 words closer to that total. It doesn't work like that, sadly. Right, so a couple of points. I'm going to hurry through this bit because this may or may not be something you want to do, but just for argument's sake, I'm going to show you how I would do it, and then I'm going to move on from it. If it's of use to you, rewind it and watch it again. If it isn't, probably give me another minute, fast forward. You could argue that 1994 is a bit long ago. Maybe there might be a more recent reference that we could use. Here's how I would do that. I would go into my bibliography and I would find the Staub and Peck article that I'm talking about. I would go into Google Scholar. I would paste in that title. Staub might help us cut through the fat. That's the article cited by 325. What that means is that 325 articles that have been indexed by Google Scholar have referenced that article. Don't just look through the list, find one that's much more recent, and then reference that instead, because you don't know without reading it if it's making the same point and if it's relevant, and a halfway decent moderator will pick that out and fail you for it. Well, maybe not fail you for it, but certainly kick you about a bit. But that's what I would do. I would look for a bit more recent. Personally, this is how I would go about doing it. Obviously, you're limited by which ones you can actually read. Don't worry about it if you can't. Don't worry about it if you don't want to. It's just a point I thought I'd make. Another point I would make: Pidgel Nacken and Mand 2003. Also this, and also again this. Now, a couple of points to make here. One's a referencing issue. This Pidgel Nacken and Mand, the first one. This one here. If that's been cited in another book, I can't remember now, it was years ago. I don't know if I've actually read this article by Pidgel Nacken and Mand, or whether I've just read something that they have been quoted as having said in this article. Personally, if I haven't read the article by Pidgel Nacken and Mand and seen what it is they've said, then I'm only going on what these people say as to what Pidgel Nacken and Mand said. Now, it might be that Rugis, Van der Veen and Pietzma have read the findings of Pidgel, Nacken and Mand, whatever they're called, and argued it well, and it's fine. It might be they've completely misinterpreted what they've said. It might be that the basis on which they're quoting these findings is different to mine. They might have a different kind of angle that they're coming at. I would personally say, if you're reading an article, so let's say for instance you're reading this article, I don't know if I can't highlight it anymore without just flooding the whole page with green. If you're reading this article and they make a point of something that Pidgel, Nacken and Mand have said and you think, oh, that's actually really useful, go and look for the Pidgel, Nacken and Mand article. Only as really a last resort do what I did, which is probably that I couldn't find the article, so I just referenced the article that I read about it in. It just doesn't feel academic to me, but that's just me. As I say, it passed at level 7, so perhaps I'm just over-reading it. Another point, Rugis, Van der Veen and Pietzma. Personally, and again, look at your guidance from your academic institution, wherever that might be. This is just me. If I'm citing something in the course of the flow of the essay, and there are more than one author, so Rugis, if it was just Rugis, I'd put Rugis brackets 2010. Once it becomes Rugis and somebody, I might at a stretch put an ampersand and then the other person's name and then 2010. Past two people, always etalit. Ital is Latin, it just means and others, I think, off the top of my head. So you would have Rugis, et al, and then brackets 2010. Ital should be in italics. I don't know if that's a standard thing, that's how I do it. Never been picked up on it, so I assume it's correct. Again, that's just personal preference, but for me, if you're going to be citing a piece of work with more than 2 people behind it, I would italic rather than put the whole list of people's names that wrote it, because it just reads like you're trying to fill up the word count by just referencing every damn person that had a hand in it. We also take stock of the fact that these studies fail to differentiate between the likely varied ability levels of the groups of developmentally typical students. Now, this developmentally typical is in speech marks. Now, I don't know if I've put it in speech marks because I'm quoting one of these studies that have used that phrase, or if I'm just using developmental, like air quotes, like developmentally typical, as if to suggest, what is developmentally typical? What does that even mean? Either way, I would want some indication as to A, whether I'm quoting it off somebody, or B, if I'm using it as a sort of air quotes thing. Because if I'm suggesting that it's not a clear concept, that there might be some debate about what that means, I would kind of expect to see some reference to that debate. Perhaps even just my take on what that means. The fact that it's in speech marks troubles me a little bit, reading back, and I wrote it, so it's only me that I'm having a go at. But even with this in mind, it seems reasonable to assert that inclusive education has not been proven to have any detrimental impact on the educational outcomes of children without additional needs. It's wordy, isn't it? Indeed, in catering to the needs of children with SEND, teachers may concurrently adapt their teaching and classroom management in ways which benefit the less able, developmentally typical students. And there I've used it again, but without speech marks. So, what have I established what that means in the intervening time? No, I haven't. So, a few points then about this. Basically, argument, background reading, and context. What that means is every paragraph really should make an argument, should make a point, should kind of develop the essay, should take it in a direction. Any paragraph that doesn't do that, why is it there? What's the point of it? So every paragraph should have an argument. It should be clear in the paragraph what argument it is. Now, that doesn't mean arguing with somebody necessarily. It doesn't mean saying Peck said this, which is rubbish.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
What it means is you're kind of making a point, and then having made a point, you're then going to offer some background reading. So you're going to say, look, all right, the idea of inclusion has been criticised because there's an argument that says if you lay on extra provisions for children with additional needs, the children who don't need those are going to be suffering, because how can a teacher spread themselves that widely in a classroom? So my argument in this paragraph is that inclusion is a good thing for everybody, and it hasn't been found to be a bad thing for the students who don't ostensibly benefit from inclusive policies. So here's my citations. Here's some people I've read about, and here's what they've said, and here's how that either validates or counteracts or whatever the argument that I'm making. Here's a little bit of criticism. So I've read through these articles, and actually I have found that they're not perfect. There's this thing here. Even with this in mind, it seems reasonable to assert that inclusive education, so this is sort of like a sort of conclusion of these arguments. So here's the argument I'm making: inclusion's fine. Background reading, here's some people that have said that it's fine, so I can prove empirically that I'm not just making this up. Here's a little conclusion about what I'm saying. And then context. This last bit that isn't yet blue or green, this bit is my context. Indeed, in catering to the needs of children with SEND, teachers may concurrently adapt their teaching and classroom management in ways which benefit the less able, developmentally typical students. That's my context. That's me saying, here's inclusion being a good thing. Here's the people that have said that. Here's a little bit of criticism. Not perfect. Here's the context. Here's why what I've just said means something in the context of this essay. Now, context works two ways, really, because one is the context of the argument that you're making in the essay as a whole. Two, it's the context of your teaching practice, because that's the other thing that's really important in a master's essay, and that's the next slide we'll look at. You need to talk about you. Don't just talk about people have said this, so-and-so wrote that, this study found this. That's fine. That proves points, that backs up arguments, that validates claims you're making, but it doesn't put it into the context of your teaching. And a master's level essay, you are not only looking at what's been said before and formulating arguments and whatever, you're looking at your teaching and how that reading benefits you. How does that reading impact on your teaching? What have you learnt from this? How are you going to change your teaching practice? What has your teaching practice done to inform your understanding of this argument? Have you found stuff on the day-to-day teaching that you do that disagrees with what you've just said here? Have you proven, in actual fact, that what Staub and Peck and all those other people have said isn't true? Because, in your experience, blah, 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 blah. That's your context. That, in some ways, is the most important part, because that shows critical thinking. That shows not just that I can read a book, I can make some notes on what people have said, and I can throw them together and go, oh, look, they said this and they said that. But it's the context that's key. It's your teaching practice that really, I feel, is the key to this.